Welcome to our lecture on information security. This will be the last of our online lectures this semester, so we're almost there. Just one more content class on innovation after this. Just a reminder about your video projects and when they're due. Note that the due date and the due time in the syllabus. These projects are due at 6 a.m. On the day that we're watching the videos, so that I can have a chance to download them to my computer and make sure they're all ready to go. So please pay attention to that. Also, please look in the syllabus. Make sure you know when the date and time of the final exams are, because they're different than our normal class times. And then also we will have a couple of things that I'll put in announcements about group peer evaluations using CATME, and then also course evaluations. So please do those. The group peer evaluations are a chunk of your participation points for the semester, and the course evaluations, there's some opportunities for some extra credit by completing those. We'll talk about that in an announcement and in class. All right, so today's topic is information security, and I like this little comic. It's all about bringing civilization to its knees. So how did the Goths do that? They did it by hacking. The Vandals through hacking their enemies. The Huns through hack. And now the geeks are doing it through hacking their enemies. Information security, though, is an often misunderstood topic. So let's first clarify what exactly we mean by security. There's a related term called information assurance that sometimes comes up. Information security is taking our information and protecting it from unauthorized access, use, or misuse, destruction, modification, or disclosure. So it's protecting our information. Now, information assurance is related to that, but this has to do with more on the disaster recovery side of things, making sure that our information is not lost when there's a problem. Okay. Now, it is my contention, and most security people's professionals' contention, that information security isn't really a technology issue. This isn't something that can just be, you can throw technology at, throw money at, and get buy some new firewalls or this or that, and solve this problem. Information security is actually a managerial issue, and that needs, managerial attention with security policies and training and lots of, a lot of organizational work rather than just buying things. And so we'll talk about some of the different things with that. Let's start in with the goals of information security. So in this image, I like how this image discusses or kind of overviews some of the goals of information security. So on the left-hand side, we have various different threats to our information security. And on the right, we have what are the targets for security attacks. So, these can be, obviously just not bags of gold or money, but we're talking about usually information assets, but also it can be monetary, financial assets as well. But on the left-hand side, the threats are, there's the sort of the quote-unquote hacker down in the bottom. But we can also talk about other sort of threats that are available, whether these are natural disasters or, cyber terrorist kind of attack. But in the middle, we have vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities in the image are depicted as sort of doors or windows. And then beyond those vulnerabilities, we have various different safeguards. Safeguards, we're going to talk about on the next slide, are to help protect us, because every security system has, or every organization has vulnerabilities, usually many, many more than they expect. And if we want to keep our information assets and our crown jewels here in this case safe, we need to have effective safeguards. There we go. Now, if you haven't come across this before, sometimes it's taught in audit classes or in some accounting classes. The fraud triangle is a really important concept. So the fraud triangle, the idea is that people don't commit fraud unless all three aspects of this triangle are in place. Now, that's not 100% true, but it's true most of the time. So here are the different things. So number one, there has to be an opportunity. So if the organization, for example, has checks in place, and procedures in place to try to eliminate opportunity, then, people don't commit fraud if they don't have the chance to do so. So there has to be an opportunity to carry out some sort of misappropriation of the organizational assets. Number two, in the bottom right-hand corner, there has to be some pressure. So there has to be some motivation or incentive for the employee or the individual to commit that fraud. This could be, they might be, have a family member who's sick and medical bills are piling up, or, they might have, made poor choices in their investing, and all of a sudden, things aren't looking well, or it's getting close to retirement and retirement savings aren't well, or they just want to buy something and they just can't do it, or the organization has had to cut back their hours and they're feeling the pressure of that. It could be a number of different ways that pressure comes. But usually when fraud is committed, the individual has been under some sort of pressure, often financial. The last at the top is rationalization. If the company, or if the employee of the company doesn't have an ability to rationalize, usually fraud isn't committed. And rationalization can mean many different things. It can be, this company is big enough, they just won't notice it. Or it could be, I'm going to pay it back at the end of the month after I pay my bills. Or it can be, I should have gotten a raise, years ago, and this is just back pay off of that. Or, whatever it happens to be, there has to be some justification for the actions. Now, with technology and with our policies and other things we'll talk about in the next slide, most of IT security and IS security is focused on the opportunity side, is to try to eliminate the opportunity. But there certainly is, compelling evidence that maybe it makes sense also to work on the other aspects of the fraud triangle. For example, are we employing and paying our workers appropriately? There's been some HR research in the last little bit that suggests that by overpaying employees relative to market, companies actually sometimes end up costing themselves less money because they have less turnover, and hiring, the whole process of that is expensive. They have less problems with institutional memory leaving as people leave, and people tend to commit less fraud and less bad behavior when they're actually compensated appropriately. And so we may have policies in place to alleviate pressure, but we're mostly talking about opportunity. So if you remember back at the beginning of the semester, we talked about the 5 components of information systems. This has come up in several of the current event presentations: hardware, software, data, procedures, and people. This is the piece of your final exam that is comprehensive, is that this comes back in terms of information security. Your final is not really comprehensive in other ways. It's on the information presented since the second exam, except for this little piece. So when we're talking about security, we do have hardware and software security safeguards. We have these what we call technical safeguards. They include, software like antivirus software and firewalls that are hardware and software. We have our, malware protection, and there's a number of different products that can be purchased that are hardware and software safeguards, and those are important. But we also have other safeguards around, for example, data. We have policies around encryption, around backup and recovery. That has a little bit more to do with information assurance, around physical security of our data centers, and also some policies and some rules around who has the rights and responsibilities to various different types of data. And then possibly most importantly is we also put human safeguards that relate to the procedures and people side of information systems. So I've talked about compensation, but we also have to worry about hiring practices, training practices, this is a big one, and education, making sure people understand. And then also, what are our procedures, our policies? How do we assess whether we're being compliant or not? How do we provide accountability so that if people break things that we actually or violate the rules, what sort of policies do we have in place, and is there a sanction at all? Is there any sort of sticks and carrots to motivate behavior towards better security? And so all of these pieces, all 5 components, have technical, data, and human safeguards related to IT security. Now, security policies are not really that exciting of a topic, but they're actually a really important thing for organizations. I want you to think for just 1 second, maybe pause the video and think about it. Do you know what the university's security policy is for and computer use policy is? Well, as it turns out, you agreed to it when you created an account, but most students don't even realize that it's there. I usually tell a brief story. When I was a PhD student, I walked into my office one day, and I had a computer that was provided for me as a doctoral student because I was teaching classes. And I walked into my office, and my computer was gone, completely gone. And there was a note on my desk that said that my computer had been seized because it had violated the university's computer usage policy. So I had to go and talk to the IT person in my organization that was over security, and apparently doing web development and installing your own web server on your computer in order to teach a class was a violation of the university's policy, and I had no idea, even though I had agreed to it. And so my computer was seized, and they wouldn't even let me say, oh, okay, I just will uninstall the Apache web server and this will all go away. They said, no, our policy is that the computer has to be completely wiped of all data. And so I had to go and, unfortunately, get my data from backup because I had violated that policy, even though it's a stupid policy. So organizations need to think very carefully about what exactly they're trying to do with their policy, what behaviors they're trying to encourage, what they're trying to discourage, and how this is onerous for the users, because security policies make things more difficult for the users. And in particular, how do we manage when people break the policies? What are the rules around this? There's a lot of research, actually recent research, on how to best do this. And sort of this is kind of evolving over time. Also, usually organizations have policies related to how email should be handled, how internet usage should be handled. Are we allowed to go to social media? Are we allowed to watch videos online during our breaks? How we're supposed to use the computers? Are we allowed to take them off the premises? Are we allowed to take data off the premises? What are the rules around passwords? We'll talk more about that. And so it's important, even though this is not a very exciting topic, it's an important topic, though, so that users in the organizations are trained and understand the security policy of the organization, and that it's effectively written so that it's not just completely ignored, and most people don't even realize it exists. All right, so let me get to some concepts before we get to some principles, and then we'll go to applications at the end. Oftentimes students will ask, what is a hacker? Sometimes they'll hear the term a white hat, black hat, or gray hat. What is this concept of a script kiddie? Sometimes students will come across that and wonder what that is. So interestingly, the word hacker actually is kind of a little bit of a misnomer now, but has changed and evolved over time. Initially, the word hacker meant someone who could hack things together and get them working. It was actually a positive term. Someone who was good at hacking and making things work was a very valuable member of the organization. But over time, there was when people started misbehaving with the computer, people, instead of calling people hackers, they started calling people who are trying to break things and create viruses and things. They started calling these individuals crackers because they were trying to break things. But over time, that term has evolved to become a racial or ethnic pejorative term, and so that term's no longer used. And so the hacker term has sort of evolved into someone who is doing bad things and trying to break into systems. But in the security community, we tend to think rather instead of the term hacker, in terms of these sort of white hat, gray hat, and black hat. Black hat is what most people and the media think of as hacker. These are the people who are trying to break into systems to steal data, to sell it, to harm organizations, harm governments, things like that. These are the quote unquote the bad guys. White hats, though. White hats, these are security researchers, individuals who work for companies that are trying to make things better, whether they're trying to make the software better for another company. A lot of companies offer bounties now. If you can find some software or a security violation in their software, they'll pay you money. Google, for example, does this. They may be hackers. When I took a security class, I was learning from the head of the former head of security for one of the big banks, who had been what's called a penetration tester, a white hat hacker. He was hired by companies to try to break into their systems so they could find out the vulnerabilities and then fix them. And so those are hackers that are white hat hackers, are those that are trying to hack things legally for good reasons. And then we have in the middle, there's gray hat hackers. And sometimes, these depend on your perspective. They sometimes depend on your political persuasion. For example, some people think that the work that hackers for WikiLeaks or for some of the rumored hackers for the recent, election and things like that, fall more into the gray hat side of things. Maybe because these are politically motivated, maybe it's okay, at least if it agrees with your politics. So this is sort of the moral or ethical gray area in between black hat and white hat. Many people would consider them to be black hats. Some of them think that, because of their desires are not necessarily to destroy, they're sometimes to reveal information or to support a political cause that, that the gray hats are maybe a little more justified. That depends on your perspective. Now, the term script kiddie has to do with a very unsophisticated person who's trying to use tools, which again may be sophisticated, but doesn't really know what they're doing. So, for example, this picture right here, the little caption there is that they're using a piece of software called LOIC, which stands for Low Orbit Ion Cannon. I don't recommend using this piece of software unless you really know what you're doing and you're okay with the FBI showing up at your door. But the idea with low orbit ion cannon is it causes denial of service attacks, which is a denial of service attack floods one or more locations with as much internet traffic as possible in the hopes of bringing them down. And so low orbit ion cannon is a tool to cause servers and computers to go down. And you can download it off the internet and just point it at a particular computer and see what happens. Again, that often will get you a trip or visit from the FBI. But a script kiddie is someone who just downloads some tool that someone else has written, doesn't really understand it, but is an unsophisticated hacker. All right, so let's talk briefly about this various types of malware, Trojans and viruses and worms, because these terms get used and sometimes we don't really know what the difference are and what they mean. Virus is the early term. All of these are bad pieces of software trying to do malicious things. The first term was a virus. Okay, this idea that a computer can be infected with something. So a virus is a bad piece of software. It tries to do, depending on its goal, it tries to do certain things, steal information or destroy things, delete files, things like that. Viruses can be copied, but as a sort of a definitional thing, the difference between a virus and a worm is that viruses can copy themselves. But what worms do is they are self-replicating viruses that worms try to make copies of themselves and spread those copies across networks. And so, for example, the Conficker worm actually still exists on the internet. It was really a bad one that would infect copies of Microsoft Windows, and it would then make copies of itself and try to share that with anyone on its local area network or across the internet if it had access to that. And so it would, self-propagate across networks. And so that's really the difference between virus and worms. Trojans are a little different. Trojans, just like the old story of the Trojan horse, where the whole wooden horse was wheeled into the city of Troy, and then at night the soldiers which were inside kind of came out of their hiding and then opened doors and then sacked the city. Trojan horses are like that. They are bad software that is hidden inside of potentially legitimate software. So, for example, one of the, several years ago, one of the kind of the first bad infestations on Macs, as Mac has become more popular, was people would download an illegal copy of Adobe's Photoshop that actually had a Trojan inside. And so, the bad software was inside of this legitimate software. They'd install this, illegal copy of Photoshop, and they'd also have a Trojan that would cause problems on their computer. All right, so let me walk through some security principles. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. Kind of the purpose of these videos is that if you need to rewatch them, you can, and I'll try to go as quickly as possible. So in the next several slides, we're going to have an information source and an information destination. And the information source is going to want to send information to the destination, to the receiver. Now, this is all well and dandy, except for out there we've got the bad guys, the black hats, or even the other colored hats, where we have these untrusted third parties. And the untrusted third parties may want to do bad things with our information. And so one of the big problems is what happens when an untrusted third party gets access to that information. The information is intercepted. Well, that's a problem. It actually violates one of the main principles of security called confidentiality. Confidentiality is, well, us wanting to keep our information not hidden from people who aren't supposed to see it, or organizations who aren't supposed to see it. We don't want it to be disclosed outside of those that are authorized to see the information. And so information interception violates that. Now, in networks and in computers, we tend to do confidentiality by, we encourage or protect confidentiality by using something called encryption. So here's how encryption works. Let's say that we take our information that we want to send to our destination. We encrypt it. Encrypted, it really just means taking our information and using a mathematical algorithm and a key. We'll talk about what that is. It's just a number. A mathematical algorithm and a key, and disguising our message into something that the untrusted third party can't understand. So what happens is the information source here encrypts the information, sends it along. The untrusted third party can't possibly understand that because it's encrypted, but the destination can understand it. And so everything is fine. The confidentiality is preserved. Now there's a couple types of categories of different types of encryption. The first one, which we really already talked about, is symmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption means that the sender and the receiver actually share the same exact key. So beforehand, you decide upon what the key is and what mathematical algorithm you're going to use. And when the information source needs to encrypt the message, they use the key, they encrypt it using the mathematical algorithm, they pass it along to the destination gets it, has the key already, because they've already decided on that, uses the algorithm and decrypts that information by kind of doing the reverse. The untrusted third party, they might even know the mathematical algorithm, but because they don't have the key, they can't decrypt that information and view it. The other type of encryption is called asymmetric encryption. And this one's really clever. We're not going to go into too much depth. I do in some of my other classes. Asymmetric encryption basically works on the idea that in mathematics, there are certain things that are really easy to do in one direction and really difficult to do in another direction. For example, in math, it's very, very easy to multiply numbers and to exponentiate numbers, okay, to raise a number to a certain power, because it's really just doing something again and again and again. It's really easy to do that. It's actually really hard mathematically, and by hard I mean computationally difficult or time consuming. It's really difficult to factor numbers. And so that principle, the fact that something is difficult to do one way and easy to do the other way, kind of is the basis for our asymmetric encryption. Asymmetric encryption means that we use a pair of keys. They're actually one key, but it's a pair of them that they go together. And you use one of part of that key, and you designate it one of them public, one of them private, and you use one of those keys to encrypt the message, and then the receiver uses the other key to decrypt. All right? So for example, if let's say this information source was given the public key for the destination, for the receiver, the information source then could encrypt that key, or encrypt the information with that key, and the untrusted third party could even have that public key. Everyone can have that public key. But because of how these keys work and because of the mathematics behind it, only the person with the private key, in this case the recipient, the destination, can decrypt that information. All right. Now, for symmetric encryption, there's a couple different categories. There's something called a stream cipher. And what happens with a stream cipher is you take whatever message you're trying to send, and each bit gets run through a mathematical algorithm one at a time, and then spit out. An example of this is an algorithm called RC4. RC4 actually gets a really bad rap because it's often misused by companies and by individuals. If it's used properly, it's a very nice cipher. It's a very nice stream cipher. If it's used improperly, it has some potential problems, and it's sometimes rather used improperly. Block ciphers are much more common, though. Block ciphers take a group of bits, like a byte or several bytes of bits, and encrypt those a block at a time, a group of them at a time. One of the most popular and common encryption standards in the world is called the AES encryption standard, the Advanced Encryption Standard, and this is the encryption standard used by the US government for top secret. There was a competition actually in order to create this standard, and an algorithm called Rijndael won this, and it's very clever in how it works. And if you want to know more, I teach a little bit more in my other classes. All right, we already talked a little bit about asymmetric encryption. It's where we have a key pair that are related. One can encrypt, one can decrypt, or vice versa. And these are very clever algorithms. The most famous here is called RSA. There are others out there, but RSA is a very common algorithm that underlies how the internet works with certificates. We'll talk about that more in a second. So let's say we have this problem, though. We already talked about when the untrusted third party can intercept the information. But what happens if the untrusted third party then gets the information and modifies that information, changes the message? What if we don't really care that the untrusted third party has the information? We don't really care if it needs to be encrypted. But if they change that information, then send it along to the destination, well, that becomes a problem. Okay, so that violates our second big security principle, and that is information integrity. We want our information that we're sending to be free from modifications, from alterations. And so the way that we handle this one is through something called hashing or digesting algorithms. And I'm not going to go into these, but MD5 and SH1 and SHA2 are examples of this. Actually, all three of these are considered to be insecure now because of the computers have gotten better in order to be able to break these. And so there's some other alternatives now to these sort of algorithms. So the idea with this is a hashing algorithm or a digesting algorithm is an algorithm that works in one direction. So it takes whatever information you get it, and it spits out a particular fixed length information. Let's see if this site is working. It might not be working today. All right, the site that was linked in the description wasn't working, but this one seems to be working. So let's say we have some text that we want to hash. So here's our secret. We want to hash that. So if we then use this tool, it will show us, hey, here's what the original text is. But if we were to run it through these various different hashing algorithms, so I talked about, for example, MD5 and SHA1, SHA256 is considered quite good right now, or at least the next one to use. Here is what gets spit out by the hashing algorithm. Now you can't take this information and go backwards and get secret. There's no decrypting of this. It produces a fixed length of the hash, okay, a certain number of characters. Now, with a good hashing algorithm, the idea is if you see this MD5 one, it's 5EBE2294, etc. If we just change something very small in the original information, the unencrypted information, and hash that, it should change the hash a lot. Okay, that means that's a characteristic of a good hashing algorithm. That if information is similar to each other, the hashes are still very, very different. So how in the world do we actually use this? Well, here's what we do. When we want to ensure integrity, we take our message, we run it through a hashing algorithm, and it produces a hash. And then we can send that hash to our destination. Then we can send the message to our destination. And then at the destination, the recipient can take the message, run it through the hashing algorithm themselves, and then compare the hashes and see if they are the same. If they don't match, then we know that the information has been, either there's an error or it's been modified. If they do match, then everything is fine. Now, in this case, integrity is only assured if the hash hasn't been modified. So what happens if we were to send the message first? Well, the untrusted third party could then take that message, and then when the hash is sent, they could then modify the message and the hash, and that's a problem. And so we usually end up combining these things. All right? Now, we'll come back to that in a second. What happens if information is interrupted? All right? What happens if it doesn't ever make it to the destination? Well, that's actually a violation of the third main principle that we'll talk about, called availability. So we want to have our systems, our information, available to authorized users whenever they need it. Confidentiality and integrity, the things we already talked about, actually depend on these things being available. And so when we're talking about these principles, we handle availability by, making sure that we have our systems that are reliable. We provide redundancy if necessary. We have backup and recovery plans. If there's some slowdown, we try to fix that slowdown or that bottleneck in our system by upgrading our hardware and software, etc. And so these three principles, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, actually comprise what's called the CIA triad. I have a slide on that in a second. Now, we have a couple of other potential problems. What happens if our untrusted third party just makes up information, fabricates it out of nothing? Well, in this case, that's also a problem. They're not modifying information, they're just making it up. And so another principle is authenticity. How do we determine that a message was actually sent by the source and it wasn't just made up? Well, there's a few things that we do in order to provide authenticity. For some things, we have information that we also provide that only we are supposed to have. Things like passwords and PIN numbers. We also have things like, you might get a message from your bank or something on your cell phone to prove that it's actually you, or use a token or a smart card. We might use biometrics, your fingerprint, your eye print, or other things. And more commonly, we start to see these things called digital certificates. And that's what I want to talk about, because these are actually much better than some of these other options. Now, related to authenticity is non-repudiation. So what happens if the recipient gets a message, maybe it's an order or something, and they fulfill that order, and all of a sudden the sender, which actually sent the message, goes and says, oh no, that wasn't me. Somebody made it up. How can we prove legally that the sender actually sent the message? All right, so both of these issues are handled by digital signatures. Here's how that works. It's based off of the asymmetric encryption and also off of hashing. So let's take our message. We've got our hash, okay, so we can produce a hash. And what we do is we encrypt the hash, then send the message along to the destination with the message and the encrypted hash. The recipient can then rehash the message, decrypt the signal, or the encrypted hash, and then compare those. Now, how do we know that it actually comes from the actual information source? Well, what happens is the information source, if they encrypt the message with their private key, which only they should have, it doesn't matter. Anyone can decrypt the message with their public key, because everyone can have the public key. But you can know that if a message can be decrypted by someone's public key, then it has to be from that information source. That's how digital signature works. Again, here's our CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we added, again, non-repudiation and authenticity to those principles. All right, let's talk briefly about some applications of security here before we finish. What makes a good password? This is a hard challenge, right? Most of you, if you think, in fact, why don't you take a minute, pause the video, think to yourself, what makes a good password? What have you been told? All right, well, hopefully you've thought about that for a minute. What makes a good password? Usually people are told, they need letters, numbers, symbols, uppercase, lowercase. And those things actually are useful, but they don't actually make as much difference as you would expect. All right, so what also makes a bad password? Well, here are some examples of the most popular passwords that have come out when companies have had their passwords leaked. And so you can see, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, not really a very good password. Passwords related to the name of the site that you're using, like Gawker for when Gawker Media is, or Gizmodo, or Lifehack for Lifehacker or Kotaku. These are not very good passwords. Passwords that are just super short, 1, 2, 3, 4, the password for my luggage, Michael and Jordan and things during things. These are not good passwords. We'll talk about again why some of these aren't very good. So I want to bring up a website called GRC's Haystack. It's a really out of date, but it shows the principles of what I'm trying to get through with passwords. And so let me walk you through how Haystack works. All right, so this is just a little website. You can search for it yourself if you want. GRC Haystack. It's created by a security researcher, and it gives us an idea of how good a password is to some extent. It's missing parts of it, and it fully recognizes that in the instructions and description. But it gives us an idea of what's called the search space and how fast it could be broken, a particular password. So if let's put in a password that's not a very good password at all. All right, PASSWRD. Let me just tell you, this is an awful password. Here's why it's an awful password. Number one, it's going to be in every password cracking dictionary. We'll come back to that in a minute and explain why that matters also. But here's what happens. So the search space depth, that means how many different characters could each individual letter or number or symbol or whatever it happens to be of the password be. In this case, we're only using lowercase. And so we really only have 26 potential characters for these because it's only lowercase. It's 8 characters long. And so if we were to, take 26, multiply it out, do the math on this, here's the overall search space, which seems like a pretty large number, but as it turns out, it actually isn't. And these numbers are exceptionally out of date, like really, really out of date. So, an offline password cracking attack, it says 2.17 seconds. It would actually take probably much less time than that. That's assuming 100 billion guesses per second, and that's pretty small time by today's standards. If we're talking about massive cracking arrays, these used to be the sort of supercomputers, but this is also like really, really underestimating how fast these things are now. I mean, we're talking about much, much less than the time it takes you to blink your eye in order to crack this kind of password. So now let's look and see, okay, what happens if we add in an uppercase letter? All right, now we've made the search space a little bit deeper, okay? So now we have potentially, 52 characters. These could all be upper or lowercase. We still have our 8 characters, and now this is starting to take a little bit longer to crack. Now, again, these numbers are super out of date. It's much lower times on these. But the point is that adding that additional uppercase letter has increased the amount of time it takes to guess this, to do what we call a brute force on this, which is to try every single option until we get there. Well, okay, what happens if we now add in a number? Okay, so that's a number 0, not an O. Now our search space is larger, okay? So each character could be not just lowercase and uppercase letters. It could also be numbers from 0 to 9. And so that gives our search space a depth of 62 potential characters. We still have the same length. And now our massive cracking array at least shows us up at 2.22 seconds in order to crack this. All right. Well, what happens if we add a symbol? All right. So there's a nice little symbol. There are 33 potential symbols in our key set, or in our standard encoding scheme. So that gives us 95 characters. And so now we're up to a couple of, a little over a minute for a massive password cracking away. Again, these numbers are out of date, but it gives you an idea that, hey, these uppercase and symbols and numbers actually did make a difference in search. But here's what I want to point out to you. Let's go back to our old password. So again, we're up to like 1.1 minutes with adding in uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols. If we go back to just lowercase, and then we just add one letter, and another letter, and another letter. Okay, we're now, and another letter. Now, so now we're up to, 16.54 minutes. All right, just by adding 4 additional letters to this. Okay, we're well above that 1 minute threshold. And what happens if we now start adding in more? Okay, now we're into hours, now we're into weeks, now we're into months, now we're into years, and we're only at 16 characters, or 16 lowercase characters. So my point here is that length matters far, far, far more than uppercase, lowercase numbers and symbols. The search depth increases the amount of time it takes to brute force this linearly. The length, each additional character, increases it exponentially. That's why length matters so much. Now, let me show you this. This is a comic from XKCD. I might need to link it in the video rather than have it in the video. This is one of their more famous comics. I really like the XKCD comic. And so let's see if I can kind of walk you through this. So here is a password, Troubadour at 3, okay? But the Troubadour has some common substitutions like, a 0 for an O and a 4 for an A. So an uncommon word. We've capitalized this letter. We've even put, maybe this one we make into an O, maybe we don't. We put a nice little symbol in here. We've got another number, throw it in there. Is this a good password? Well, for most people, on what they've been told about passwords, that it would be considered a good password. And as it turns out, it's actually kind of a bad password. And here's the reason why. Is even with all of those, the search space, or the amount of what we call entropy, how much sort of chaos, I guess, is in that password. If we've got 1,000 guesses per second, it would take about 3 days because of the length. And yeah, okay, that's a little bit of time, but 1,000 guesses per second is not very much, okay? It's much easier to guess that. This is a super easy for computers to break. But then again, how hard is this to remember as a password? It's actually, at least for me, really difficult to remember this kind of things. Oh, did I substitute this 0 or did I substitute this 0? Did I make this a 4 or that A into a 4, or did I make it into an @ symbol? What was the character and symbol? These are hard to remember. So now we have, down here, we have correct horse battery staple. These are 4 random actual words, all lowercase, all just strung together. Now, as it turns out, this is actually a pretty good password. Except for one reason, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's pretty good. It is much, much, much more difficult for if we're guessing 1,000 guesses per second, it would take 550 years in order to guess that, which is a lot different than the 3 days that this one would be. So even on a massive password cracking array, this is still a time-consuming thing. And so, could you remember correct horse battery staple if you were to say it a few times? Correct horse battery staple. I think you could probably figure out correct horse battery staple and memorize that. And even with this picture of a correct horse battery staple, then you could probably remember correct horse battery staple. So it's an easy to remember. That's why many organizations, including our university, is moving towards passphrases where length matters instead of characters. Now, would it be fine to add any of those uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, spaces in here? Would that increase the entropy? Sure it would. But length matters far, far, far more. So we want long passwords that are memorable. Because the worst thing is people are working in an organization where you have to have a password much like this Troubadour one. They can't remember it, and so they write it down, put it on a sticky note, put it under their keyboard or next to their monitor. And that's far, far worse security. Also, organizations tend to make people change their passwords all the time, which makes sense if they're giving away and they've lost their password. But if they haven't done those things, it's just making it more difficult for them to remember their passwords. It's kind of a bad policy to switch your password around a lot, unless you really think that something's been compromised. So how do we do this? Well, I want you to think for yourself, how many of you have a different password for every single service, website, app that requires you to log in? Normally when I ask this question to classes, there's usually 1 or 0 people who raise their hands. That nobody has, a unique password that's available for all of their different services. But why not? Isn't that good security to have different passwords? Password reuse is a huge problem. The other huge problem is something called, in fact, let me go back for a second, is with these passwords, dictionary attacks are problematic. In the Haystack one that I did, we were talking about brute force attacks. That means trying every single combination. But as it turns out, why would we try every combination if we can first try every word in a dictionary, for example? That would let us try a whole bunch of combinations that are real words rather than trying all these gibberish things. And so if your password is in a dictionary, or if the words are in a dictionary, for example, correct horse battery staple was a great password before this comic was created, and now it's a terrible password because it's probably in every password cracking dictionary, correct horse battery staple. Similarly, the bad guys, the hackers, are starting to get much, much better. So their dictionaries are now including things like song lyrics and movie scripts that have quotes in them, and religious texts like the Bible and Quran and things like that. And so oftentimes when people will choose what they think to be good passwords because, my favorite song, I'm going to pick, whatever, or my favorite book quote or whatever it happens to be. Oftentimes those are now in password cracking dictionaries, and we can check all of the things in the dictionary way faster than we can brute force and check every single combination. And so be careful that your password's not in a dictionary. Now, what if we took this correct horse battery staple and then we wrote, correct horse battery staple, 2 dinosaurs with an exclamation point. Would that be then a pretty good password? Yeah, it probably would, because even if correct horse battery staple was in the dictionary, the 2 dinosaur exclamation point combination with correct horse battery staple wouldn't be. All right, and then password managers. Password managers are a little bit controversial in the security world, but I personally am a fan of them, and I think that they are useful for people to know about. So there are a number of them out there. For example, there's LastPass, there's KeePass, there's OnePass, there's a bunch of others out there. I'm not trying to advertise. I happen to use LastPass. You might have seen the app. That's this symbol. This used to be the symbol. They've changed it. You might have seen it as I've used the computer this semester. The way that password managers work is that they rely on you having one really good password that protects your password manager's what they call vault, and that you put your other passwords into that password manager. So here's what I mean by that. All right, so I've logged into LastPass. This is the account that I have for LastPass, and I've searched for Spotify. Now, I haven't used Spotify for a little while, but I have no idea what my Spotify password is. But I have it saved in my vault. And so I could go and I could, copy and paste the password or edit this. But, if I go to Spotify, and if I want to go and log into Spotify here, all I do is now I've already put my password in before I went up to this site. I've already put my big, long, really secure that no one knows in the world LastPass password. And I've saved my Spotify password, and I can log in here automatically for me and go to Spotify, and it will ask me if I want to, change my personal information, etc. So the cool thing is when I log into, or when I go to a new site and go and search for things, that I don't have to remember any of those passwords. I can have a different password for every single site that's stored in my vault. And if I need to create a new password, I can have LastPass generate one that's really long, that looks crazy like those passwords that I never want to remember, that's really, as long as I want it to be, 100 characters even if I want to. That has numbers and symbols and all of those things if I would like, and then just have it save it in my vault. And so all the passwords can look like that, or like that, or like that, or anything else, but they're different for every single site that I use. Now, you've got to be careful. For example, I specifically don't have my main email passwords in my LastPass vault, so that if I ever need to reset my passwords, or if someone gets access to my LastPass vault and tries to reset all of my passwords, that they can't because they don't have access to my email password. But then I only have to remember really 2 passwords. Now, I happen to remember a few more than that, but I can have hundreds of different passwords. I can go and do things like I can shop on Amazon and have no idea what my password is, as long as it's in my LastPass vault and I can put it into Amazon whenever I need to. Now, LastPass and other password managers, I think, are a very nice middle ground for security. That if people are careful with them, that if they don't use the same password for every site, that if they have a very good and secure and unknown password on their vault, that they can be really effective and can help students out. And so I always recommend considering a password manager, trying it out and seeing what you think. They have different bells and whistles. Some of them have free accounts, some of them have paid accounts. Check them out and see what you think. I currently am on the free account for LastPass, but there's other options out there. Another thing that students often ask me about is something called Tor. Now, Tor stands for the Onion Router. That's what TOR stands for. Tor is meant to provide something called anonymity. Now, anonymity is not confidentiality. It's different than that, okay? Anonymity means that people don't know who the message came from, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's confidential, that it only goes to the recipient. So here's what I mean by that. Let's say that this little sort of blue cloud is the Tor network of servers. And so each one of these kind of bullseyes is what we call a Tor node, but it's really a computer. Okay, so each of these is a computer, and those that are on the outside of the cloud are called exit nodes. So if you're using Tor, you have a client on your computer and you're trying to send the information to the web server, and you want to post something anonymously up to the web server over here. Well, what you do is you can talk to, it's not pictured on this diagram, but there's some servers that will give you a listing of all of these Tor nodes. And it also will let you know which ones are exit nodes and which ones are not. The ones in the middle tend to be called relay nodes. And so you can download a list of all of these nodes. And then what happens is your Tor client on your computer, you have to download this, your Tor client will then choose a random route through the Tor network that ends at an exit node. And then what it does is it uses encryption in a very clever way. So it uses asymmetric encryption most of the time. It doesn't have to, but it typically uses asymmetric encryption. And the way that it works is it will first, because all of these Tor nodes, their public keys are widely known. So what will happen is your client will take your message and encrypt it for the last, your exit nodes, using the exit node's public key. And then it'll put a little envelope in there, and it'll say, hey, here's where you need to go next, and it'll have the information on the message and what server it's supposed to go to. And then it will backtrack through the network and go, in this case, to device C, which is a relay. To B, which is a relay. And it will then encrypt the previously encrypted message using B's public key. And so on. It will then encrypt, using A's public key. And so you have a message that's not encrypted, that's encrypted using this public key, and then that whole thing is encrypted using this public key, and then that whole thing is encrypted using this public key, and then that is what's sent out all the way back to the client, and then that's what's sent out onto the network. And so device A can see where the message came from. They know about the client right here. They know its IP address. They know everything about it. Or, well, not everything, but they know, where it's coming from. But they actually don't know anything about the destination. They can decrypt this message using their key and send it along, because the decrypted message says, hey, so the message needs to go to B now. And so they can send it along, but then they don't store where that message came from or where it went to. Then B goes and says, oh, okay, I just got a message from A, but I don't know where it came from before that. I'm going to decrypt it using my key. Oh, I can decrypt it. Oh, now it says I need to send this message over to C. And so the message then is sent over to C. C gets this message and says, oh, I just got a message from B. I don't know where it came from before that, but it looks like I can decrypt this using my private key. And I'm going to then send it on to, it looks like it goes out to a web server, exits the Tor relay network, and then goes out to the web server. Now, at this point in time, the connection between C and the final destination is not encrypted in any way. And so if you had a message that had your name in it, you would no longer be anonymous. But if you properly, route your message through the Tor network, then the message does become anonymous. No one can track where the message came from on the internet. Now, interestingly, as a lot of the WikiLeaks and all of the Edward Snowden stuff has come out around the NSA, it's been pretty clear that there are a couple pieces of technology, security technology, that the NSA really dislikes, and Tor is one of them. So if the NSA dislikes the Tor network, it's because they have a hard time breaking and circumventing the security provided by the Tor network. So this is a very good way of providing anonymity in messages that you send. Now, one caveat with this is the Tor network does have a finite number or a finite bandwidth, because each message has to go through one of these nodes, and these are all volunteer organizations that are volunteering their servers and bandwidth. So the Tor network tends to be used by people who want to do, for example, illegal file sharing and stay anonymous and things like that. I recommend not doing that, because Tor can be used for a number of what many people consider to be very legitimate purposes, letting people protest against their governments, especially if their governments are not being effective or doing human rights violations and things like that. And so don't use this for illegal file sharing, but you can use it if you need anonymity online. All right, so that's all I want to talk about with security. So for next class, we will do, this is kind of a conceptual dive into security. Next class, we'll have some current events, but we'll also talk briefly a little bit about security and then get into innovation. It'll be our last class of the semester that has content in it, and then we'll move on towards our video project. So be aware of the due dates for all the things that are coming up, but we're on the home stretch. We're almost there.